So we are recording this session today, and it'll take us a couple days to get the recording processed, and it will be posted on the Transportation Pandemic website also. So we do have a new webpage available. We published it 2 weeks ago. It's entitled Transportation During the Pandemic. You can get to it from the homepage at OSBA, or you can get to it from the Transportation Services site. And we're trying to collect an awful lot of information for you there. All right, so let's jump right into the subject matter for today. I want to review something that came out as part of the Ohio Department of Health guidance for K through 12 schools. This was published the same week that ODE released their Restart and Reset document. And just to be very clear, what ODH Department of Health has said to us is that school staff must wear masks. And so that's not an optional thing. That is a requirement for school staff. And it's just like other businesses, any adults you have in the building, whether it's staff or volunteers, they must wear face coverings unless it's unsafe to do so, or where doing so would significantly interfere with the learning process. So here are the exceptions that ODH has listed. In a scenario where facial coverings in the school setting are prohibited by law or regulation, that is not the case here in Ohio. Facial coverings, if they're a violation of documented industry standards, that's also not an issue here in Ohio. If facial coverings are not advisable for health reasons, so these would be a health reason that is specific to the individual. If they are a violation of the school's documented safety policies, again, that should not be an issue. Here's an important note. Facial coverings are not required when staff are working alone in an assigned work area. So if you think about this with respect to our school bus drivers, if they're empty in the bus by themselves, it would certainly appear that with this guidance, they could remove the mask while they're driving the vehicle. So for example, when they're going from the lot to the first stop, or after they're done, or after they're returning to storage, it would certainly appear that it's acceptable for them to remove their mask. And finally, if there's a functional, i.e. practical reason for a staff member or volunteer to not wear a facial covering in the workplace. Let me get this thing to advance on us. Here we go. What ODH also says is that schools must provide written justification to local health officials upon request, explaining why a staff member is not required to wear a facial covering in the school. So, and we're seeing this happening some with business and restaurants. If individual staff are not wearing a mask, it's not uncommon that the public might file a complaint or make a contact to the health department. And if that were to happen, then the school would have to provide a written justification as to why a particular staff person is not wearing a mask. And so what ODH says is at the minimum, facial covering should be cloth, fabric, and they should cover an individual's nose, mouth, and chin. You, like I, have probably visited establishments where we see folks that are pulling the masks down, and I in a restaurant over the weekend where staff had their masks on, but they were around their neck. That certainly is not compliant with the regulations. So what you need to direct your staff is that the masks need to be worn appropriately. So the question comes up, what about masks on school bus drivers? And I had some contacts from some districts over the weekend, specifically in the Morgan County area, which is in southern Ohio, and if it's happening there, it might be happening in other areas. There's been some information floating around indicating that the state patrol may have taken a position that bus drivers are not allowed to wear masks. I have been in contact with staff at OSP headquarters here in Columbus, and this response that they gave to me is there's nothing within federal or state code that would prohibit a school bus driver from wearing a mask. So if you have heard from somewhere that law enforcement in Ohio is going to prohibit school bus drivers from wearing a mask, that's simply not true. If there's an officer who is sharing that information, they're doing that of their own volition, and that is not the state policy. So what is important to know is that there is no pre-existing rule or law that overrides ODH's requirement for face coverings for bus drivers. So here's an interesting question that's come up. There's a conversation also going on in the field about masks versus shields. And folks have asked, well, is it acceptable to wear a shield instead of a mask? And yes, it is. ODH's guidance discusses face shields as an acceptable alternative for a face mask. And in fact, if you read their documentation, it also gives a reference to the Journal of American Medical Association, which provides additional information about masks and shields. I've provided that link for you here on this slide. If you go to it, it's an interesting article. I read it yesterday and looked through it, and they actually take the position in their documentation that shields may be better than a mask. What you do want to do is if your drivers are going to wear shields, you want to make sure that they're of good optical quality, because what we don't want is distortion for the bus drivers as they're looking through them and trying to operate the vehicles. But again, this is a great article to read. If you've got staff that are interested in a shield instead of a mask, take a look at it, read it, and indeed, shields might be an option that you want to consider in your own district. I don't know how many of you had an opportunity to watch the governor's press conference yesterday, but the governor announced yesterday that there is a new order being issued from the Ohio Department of Health, and that is all children in grades K through 12 going to school must wear a mask. And so the previous recommendation was that children in grades 3 through 12 wear masks, so that has now been changed. And the new order from the Department of Health here in Ohio is that all children in grades K through 12 must wear a mask. There are a few exceptions to that, medical reasons, other things like that. We will get that order posted on our website so that you can read it in its entirety and look at all the detail. But this is actually consistent with what our Pupil Transportation Task Force recommended a number of weeks back, and that as children get on a school bus, we want all of them to wear the mask. And that's not only to protect themselves and each other, but more significantly for us, we want them to protect the drivers so that they're not infected by students that may come on board. I have a couple of questions here. So one of the questions is that there are some people saying a shield is not enough from a virus perspective and the mask should be worn in addition to the shield. I would encourage you to go back and look at the link that I have in a previous slide. Let me back up real quickly here so you can see it again. Go to this link at the Journal of American Medical Association. They make no reference in there to wearing both a mask and a shield. They see a shield by itself is acceptable and perfectly good. You know what we all have to watch out for in this environment, and there's so many questions, and sometimes folks offer personal opinions about things. We have to be careful with the opinions that we listen to. As you and I know, everybody has opinions. But let's, really make an effort to find information from good sources. And I think that we can trust the Journal of American Medicine. Have another district here indicated that they tried shields and found them to be way better for their drivers. So take a look at that. There's a question about what about masks for preschool bus riders? Well, The order coming out from ODH is specific. It talks about students in grades K through 12. So at a local level, you'll have to determine what you want to do with the preschoolers. In general, there are recommendations coming from the Pediatrics Academy and the AMA talking about young children. Clearly, they say children of ages 2 should not be wearing masks. If you have 3 or 4-year-olds, I would encourage you to have some conversation with your local health department and see where they stand on that, see if you can get some good information from them. So the other thing the governor announced yesterday is that Ohio has procured 2 million masks from FEMA. They're being brought into the state. Those are for use by staff and students in Ohio's public education system. And they're going to be distributed from the state to our ESCs, and then the ESCs will be distributing them to your district. So if you're looking for masks, there actually is a source coming up here for masks without cost through the educational system here in Ohio. Just a note on pandemic resources as we move on here. OSBA has created a web-based resource for schools with all kinds of pandemic resources. And I'm not talking just about the transportation page now here. Our staff at OSBA and our communications department have created a dedicated web page with all kinds of references on it. And you can get to it by going to our homepage. There's a link that floats across the homepage. You can click on it and go to that. Included on that page, you can get to the transportation documents that we have up. So you can get to everything from one place. One of the interesting additions is that we have been collecting school reopening plans from around the state. And so there's quite a lot of them posted. So if you're interested in what's going on in other areas and what other districts are doing, take a look at that page, and you can get some information there. I'm scanning the chats as these come through, and there's a question there that says, if athletes don't have to wear masks at games, do they need to wear a mask to and from on the bus? So again, let's separate things. We're not talking about games here. We're talking about transportation. And so if you as a district institute a policy that all students on the buses have to wear a mask, then all students on the bus have to wear a mask. And as a district, you certainly have the authority to do that. All right, so here's the big question. And many of you have asked it. It's going around the state. I'm probably getting 5, 6, 7 phone calls or emails every day. And the question is, well, what if we're closed? And so what if you are closed? And then the question is, do you still have to transport to non-public and community schools? So let's dive into that. On July 8th, there was a letter sent from State Superintendent Paulo DeMaria to every public school superintendent in the state. And it covered a number of items, but I want to bring to your attention 2 things that were included in that letter. The first thing that Superintendent DeMaria shared with your superintendents is that, and this is a direct quote right from his letter, he said, if schools are in session, districts are required to provide transportation to chartered, non-public, and community school students whenever they're open, regardless of whether the public district is open or closed. Weekends are excluded. Now, many of you will recognize that is the position that we're with because of the code that's in 3327.01, but also because of an attorney general's opinion that was issued back in 1983 that says we have to honor the calendars even if it's asynchronous. However, in the letter that Superintendent DeMaria sent out, there was an additional sentence in there, and it's very important that you read that sentence, and then we'll jump in between the lines. In the event of a full or partial school district or school building closure, transportation of public, chartered non-public, and community school students may be deemed unsafe, and therefore district would not transport any students. I think that sentence is of critical importance to each one of you, and you need to think about that as you work with your superintendents in your local health department. So if we look at that letter from the state superintendent and try and figure out what direction we're getting, we need to add one more part to the puzzle. We've all received guidance from the governor and from the Ohio Department of Health directing school superintendents and local health officials to work together to make local decisions. In those conversations, the discussions absolutely should include all students in the community, and I think it's very important that we discuss transportation as well as school closure. Here's the issue, and some of you have called me directly, and we've had a conversation about this. If the community is at risk, and I equate this to a snow day or an ice day, if the community is at risk, it can't be safe for some students and not others. That's a very important concept. And so talk to your superintendents. When your superintendents work with the local health directors that cover your district, it's important to note that what you're talking about is all the students in the community. So the students in your district all live together, regardless of what school they go to. If the health director says to your superintendent, it is too dangerous to open the schools and we have a health risk, the pandemic infection rates are too high, so we need to shut down schools, then it can't be safe for a student in one house and not be safe for a student that lives next door. So we really have to think about our schools as communities. Make sure that your superintendents have the conversation with the health directors that talk about not only school open and school closed, but let's talk about the public transportation element as at all. Somebody's asked if we can get a copy of the letter. That letter was sent to all the superintendents. I'm making a note here real quick. I do have a copy of that letter, and we'll get it posted on the Transportation Pandemic Resource. So those of you that want to see that letter, will certainly get it up for you. I have another question in the chat that, what about career technical schools? So let's talk about what the law says for whether you call it a career tech or a vocational school. In 332701, there is a line that was added, this was during my tenure with the state, that specifies a public school's obligation for the career tech or the vocational schools. And in essence, what it says is that regardless of what your high school transportation policy is, the minimum requirement for your vocational students is to transport them from your high school to the campus where they're being educated. So if you're in a compact, we have a number of those around the state, that might mean those students need a shuttle from your high school to the high school where their program's being offered. If you're in a career tech or a jointure, what that means is you would have to run a bus from your high school to the vocational campus. There is no obligation in the code for you to run transportation from home to school, and then at the end of the day, back to home. The minimum standard in 3327 is point to point. So you can run the bus just from your high school to them. Again, going back to the conversation about, if schools are closed, you need to think about, why are the schools closed? Are your schools closed because the health risk is too high in the community? And if it is, then work with the health department. But let's go back to the line from Superintendent DeMaria's letter. Transportation may be deemed unsafe for students if the infection rate is too high in your community. So look at why your schools are closed. Is it is it an elective thing? Is it what the teachers want, what the community wants, what the parent wants? Or is it because the level of infection in your community is simply too high, in which case it's not safe for anybody to collect in a public place, whether it's a school building or the school bus. We have a question about, do we have to transport students that cannot wear masks for medical reasons? And I'm not going to be able to answer that one from a state perspective. What we don't have is any guidance on that. If you as a district have a local policy that nobody can get on a bus without a mask, then what you and the superintendent and the local health director are going to have to figure out is, are there cases where you need to figure out alternatives for some students, or do you have to make exceptions? There's no clear guidance in the code. Again, the guidance that's been issued really for everybody, and it comes back to the first bullet point on this slide, is both the governor and ODH, and to be fair, CDC and everything else has also said these are going to be local decisions. So the school superintendent and the local health official need to work together to figure out how you're going to decide. So here's a question: if your district's on a hybrid schedule and does not have students every day, but the non-public school is open every day, do you have to transport them if you're not in session? Well, this really goes back to the first point that Superintendent DeMaria shared with us in the letter, and that is we have an obligation under Ohio's code to honor asynchronous calendars. And if you're on a hybrid schedule, let's face it, you have students that are in the school building, right? Not all, not same time. You've got different waves going on. But if the non-publics and the community schools are open and they're not hybrid, they're on their regular schedule, they're not bound by what you're doing. And so if you're busing some of your students to school, you know, I don't know how you can say that there's too much disease in the community to shut down the buildings and the buses. So in all likelihood, you're going to be held responsible for transporting those non-public students, even if you're on a hybrid schedule. And I know that's going to be a huge challenge for logistics when we talk about transportation and how to manage it. But that's the way the code is structured in Ohio right now. All right. This will be the third meeting where we've touched on this, but this is very, very important. We shared some information with you 2 meetings ago. In the last meeting, Doug shared a little bit. This whole notion of using public transit for transportation service is still in the minds of some of our legislators. And so I want to share with you that Senator Andrew Brenner, who is from the Central Ohio area, recently sent a letter to the other members in the Senate, the other senators, looking for co-sponsors on a bill that he wants to introduce. And what I've done here is provided excerpts from his letter. I will go ahead and post the entire letter on our website so that you know that it's there. You need to be aware of this. And if you are a district that uses public transit to move some of your students, that's not everybody, I recognize that. It affects, I did a check yesterday on our data, about 15 districts in the state. But here's the essence of what he has said to his fellow senators. He says he's been made aware that certain school districts have moved to an all online approach and have begun to deny chartered, non-public, and community school students transportation, and instead are trying to provide a voucher for the regional public transit authority. Now, probably voucher is not the right word. In essence, what that refers to is giving them a bus pass or paying for them to ride regional public transit bus. He goes on to say that this has been used successfully for high school students. He believes it's totally inappropriate for kindergartners and first graders without responsible adult supervision. So here's the next thing, and I've underlined this, and I'm quoting his words again. Please understand we don't necessarily agree with this. I'm just telling you what he is saying to folks. In refusing to provide responsible and safe transportation, these school districts are denying students the opportunity to learn and violating ORC 3327.01 in the process. So he has sent that out. He's looking for co-sponsors. And so we need to be prepared to work locally with your own elected representatives. If this is going to have an impact on you, you need to let them know that. You know, it's ironic that at the same time that we're reducing the transportation funding budget, we have elected members in the legislature that also want to start eliminating one of the very cost-effective ways to move students if you're in an urban environment. All right, let me go over to the chat here just a second. Someone has asked, is there any ruling on distancing on buses? So again, if you're wondering how many people you can put on a bus, and I've heard from a couple of school districts that say they're waiting to get a ruling from ODE or ODH or the governor on how many kids you can put on a bus, you're going to wait a long time because they've said they're not going to do that. So take a look at the recommendations that our pupil transportation task force put together. In short, what we're saying is that in moderate risk environments, the recommendation is you can consider 2 students in a seat. And again, just to reiterate, folks say, well, how is 2 students compliant with a 6 feet social distance? What everybody has said, and read the ODH documents very carefully, is that social distancing is not always practical. When it's not practical, there are other things you can do to protect the health and well-being of individuals, including monitoring symptoms, aggressive cleaning, and strong insistence on the use of masks and personal protective equipment. All right, so let's jump to the next page here. And we had an interesting change last week. Perhaps some of you have been following the news with regard to Mr. Householder. Mr. Householder is under indictment under federal charges. He has been removed as the Speaker of the House, and the members of the House have installed a new Speaker who is Bob Cupp. Representative Cupp was a joint sponsor of House Bill 305. He and Representative Patterson worked together on that. And House Bill 305 dealt with a lot of school funding issues, but most significantly for us, they convened a pupil transportation funding study group. And I will tell you that that group made great strides in helping members of the legislature understand the needs of districts with regard to transportation. So unfortunately, that bill never got out of committee in the last budget cycle, but Representative Cupp, Representative Patterson, and other key members of the House have a really good understanding of transportation now. So on the upside, we now have a Speaker of the House who understands the history of transportation funding and what needs to be done to address it. So, you know, budget considerations never go away. We have a budget bill every 2 years, but as soon as one bill is passed, we're immediately working on the next one. So I think this is a good sign for us, and we should look forward to, you know, possibly getting some more language and some more consideration in helping us with transportation issues. So the question on the side saying, what's going to go on with the October count? And I deliberately did not put a slide in this presentation about the T1 because we have not heard anything from ODE yet about the T1. Now, under the bill that was passed regarding the pandemic back in March and April, ODE, specifically the Superintendent of Instruction, Paula DeMaria, has the right to push deadlines back 90 days. So they could push the deadline for the T1 back 90 days, even though the date of that collection is codified in the revised code. They do have the option to push it back. With a number of schools starting in an online basis or perhaps on a hybrid schedule, I think there's going to be a very significant impact on how we manage counts. And there has not been any word from ODE yet about what's going to go on there. I will continue trying to learn more about that, and hopefully we have something. You know, as soon as we know something more about that, we'll get it out to you. All right. How do we stay sane in a wild world? This is, and we said this back in March, this is going to be one of the hardest summers that transportation administrators will have ever had in their career, and perhaps harder than you'll ever have again in the future. And so I want to talk for just a couple of minutes about what do we do to survive? How do we, how do we stay sane? How do we get the job done without pulling your hair out or saying, that's it, I need to retire? So I want to remind you of something. Transportation has been successful in Ohio for decades, and we've done a great job of providing safe school transportation for Ohio's children. And that's not by accident. What we've been doing is using management tools and procedures and systems that have all led you to great successes. And I want to encourage you, even in this wild environment that we live in right now, don't be afraid to rely on the management tools that you've used in the past. So one of those that, and those of you that have been in class with me know that I'm a huge advocate of the task calendar. I think having a task calendar helps you keep in mind what you need to do, when you need to do it, and helps you from overlooking things. So here's what I want you to remember. All required tasks are still there. When you do them might be a little bit different. And that's just like the T1. It might be a little bit different. Amy has put a note out here that one of the staffers at ODE told folks that the T1 will be due on the same day with the same count week. And I guess what I need to say to you is, I don't know that staff below the level of the state superintendent really are in a position to answer that. And I will tell you that we are working with staff at a significantly higher level at ODE. And in some cases, the legislature is getting involved. And so I think some of the answers that some of you may have gotten from ODE staffers at a consultant level may be premature. I don't know if they have the information to know what's going to be changed or what's not going to change. So hang tight. And, again, I don't want you to panic about things in the future. Let's deal with what we've got right now. So back to the task calendar. What's in a good task calendar? First off, it should include everything that you have to do throughout the year. And that's not just in October, just not in October. Or in August or September or January. So if you don't have a task calendar, the very first thing you do is get everybody together in the office that knows what they've done in the past, and look at all the obligations and start by just making a list. Just get a flip chart out or a whiteboard or an Excel sheet, whatever works for you, and start making a list of all the things that have to be done throughout the year. This is a great opportunity. Turn off your phones, lock the door, turn off the radio. Just think about what the tasks are. And don't be specific for this year. Think about what's going on around the whole year. And then group those tasks. Consider grouping them into routing, personnel, fleet, district, ODE reports, and the fiscal budget. And so once you've grouped those, then the next thing to do is to chart them by month. So some things have due dates, like a T1 or a T2, they have a due date. So obviously, the T1 is going to be in October, November. The T2 is going to be in July and August. Other things don't have due dates. So what we want to do is try to balance your workload. And so it's not too difficult to create a task calendar for your school district for transportation in general. So do that, not being specific for the pandemic. Then what we have to do is think about, okay, well, what about this year? So maybe you already have a task calendar, and probably many of you do. If you don't, go ahead and create one. But now what you need to do is pull out your task calendar and say, okay, what about this year? Nothing seems to be working at the right time. So take the tasks on your calendar that have shifted and just move them around. They don't go away. They just have to be in a different location. You need to make certain you're still getting all the required tasks done. Please don't take that task list and abandon it. It's a tool that has worked for you in the past. Let it work for you again today. Um, you know, some of you have heard me say this in class, is when we're faced with a dinosaur, how do you eat that thing? And what we have to do is eat that dinosaur one bite at a time. We'll get it down. The pandemic's hard. The changes in transportation are hard. But if you stick with the tried and true tools, let them guide you through, that's a tool that will help you. And again, if you have staff working with you in the office, that whole list doesn't belong to you. Share the list. Make sure everybody has their assignments. So here's an example just of a portion of a sample task calendar. And I put this in here not because it's right for you, but because collaboratively, when we've done work groups in our MTA courses, folks have, this is one sample of one of the task calendars that we put together. But hopefully this just gives you an idea what it should look like. And you can see across the top, we've got the different columns for the subjects. And then on the left side of this, you can see the months and you can group things. So this is an important thing to have on the wall. It's a nice management tool just to keep you moving. All right, so here's the other thing that everybody's tripping over is that how do we do routing when we don't know what we need to do? You know, people haven't decided who's going to ride the bus, how many kids we put on the bus. Are the buses going to run or the buses not going to run? Here's what we have to remember. Transportation is a key component in safe schools. And in order to have safe transportation, we have to have a good routing plan. Don't let this year's pandemic issues overwhelm you and overshadow your routing needs and then leave the route planning in disarray. So what I want to do, I'm going to spend a couple minutes here just reviewing some basic routing things that might be useful for you. All of you know this stuff, but I thought it might be helpful for us to spend a couple minutes just going back to the basics, and maybe that'll just help get you out of panic mode and remember, okay, how do we do this in an orderly basis? So let's break this into different pieces. First thing is the student information. That starts with a district database download. You want to make sure that you get the kindergartners, the special ed students, and the regular students. So one of the challenges with kindergartners is lots of times you don't hear about them until August. Maybe it's even the week before school starts. Well, with school starting a little bit later, maybe you have a little bit more lead time in order to manage the kindergartners this year. So get that database download. You also need to have information from the non-publics and the charter schools. They need to send you their rosters. One of the challenges you have in transportation is making sure student addresses are accurate. And if you use a routing system, you need to make sure that the addresses that come from the database match the addresses that you have in your routing system. And so while you're waiting for someone to decide who goes back, who doesn't go back, maybe transportation's been delayed for 4, 5, 6 weeks. Now's the opportunity to start cleaning up those addresses and then finding out if there's alternative addresses for students if you're using them. And again, one of the recommendations of the task force was to eliminate alternative addresses this year. Get the emergency contact information, you know, the kind of stuff that we always struggle with in October. Well, if you're not running your buses now, now's a good time to start working on that. And then I got one that's highlighted in yellow here because we might not know the answer. You can identify who's eligible now based on what the district's policy is now, but here's one where you might have to come back to this point if the district changes its eligibility. And a lot of districts are doing that right now. I see one district where they indicated that they've canceled their high school busing. I know of a couple districts that have moved from 2 tiers to 4 tiers just to help spread the students out. So if your school board and your administration decided already, then you can plan this one. If they haven't, go with what you have right now, and then just know that this is something you might have to come back to adjust. And then the final part of this is this year, more than any other year, it's very important that you communicate with the parents and find out who plans on putting their child on the bus. Some parents have no intent of sending their child out to the bus stop, put them on the bus. Others can't wait for the buses to get running again so they can put their kids out there. So this would be a great year to survey the parents, figure out who wants to ride, and then that becomes who you route for. I know in the district that I'm living in, they sent communications to the parents saying, you need to sign up to ride the bus this year, and if you don't, the bus won't be coming. Let's talk about fleet. First off, you need to know how many buses are available. And so you should know the size of your fleet, figure out how many spares you've got. Consider the size of your buses. Are they 65s? Are they 66s, 72s, 74s? Because that's going to determine how many students you can put in the bus. And then the more important question is how many drivers do you have available? You might have 350 buses available, but if you only have 100 drivers, you're only going to run 100 routes. And then we have the big question on this slide, which we don't have the answer. Sometimes we don't have the answer to this yet. Sometimes this may change tomorrow. And that is, how many students will you put in a seat? If you're going with the moderate risk model that the Transportation Task Force put together, you're going to go with 2 per seat, and you're going to leave the front row empty to create a buffer zone around the driver. So you could plan based on that. How about your routing maps? Do you have accurate street level maps? Accurate address ranges? Do you know which side of the road is odd and which side is even? Some of the routing systems now will even show you property boundaries. So they'll show you, you can see where the lines are, and at least one of the packages out there will link to Google Earth. So you can actually get a bird's eye view and see where it's dark, where there's sidewalks, where there's trees. Make sure your maps look really good. Hazardous areas should be something that your district has used for years, and so have those on the maps. And then make sure that all of your students fit on the map somewhere. Are they located on the map where they really live, and are they on the right side of the street? So again, this is work that we do every year. This is a basic part of routing, setting up your routing program for the school year. These are the basics. Even though we're living under a pandemic and we're struggling with, okay, what are the tiers going to be? What times are we going? This work still has to be done. So get the basics done. Don't freeze and stop and not do any of this because we're waiting for the answers. All this work can still be done. Keep you moving forward. Then we have some secondary needs in routing, and that is for some of our special schools, and I don't mean special ed, although that's certainly an issue also, but for the career centers, the vocational schools, the non-publics, the charter schools, and the STEM schools, we need to know what their bell times are, what their calendars are, and are they going to move or change or adjust their loading zones? And so, even if we don't know what the pandemic impacts are, this is still information you need to know. So go ahead and get it. Assign one of your staff, if you have staff available, to go out and collect this information. Some of you now have time because your school is delayed and maybe starting on a remote mode, here's an opportunity to collect this information and maybe make life a little bit easier when it does become time to get the buses going. Here's the tough slide. At a district level, here's the unknown. And so in many cases, there are discussions going on about bell times, about how long we're going to allow children to ride on the bus, about how many students we're going to put on the bus, and special conditions that may be applied this year. Now we know that masks are now required. Some schools are talking about adjusting the stops where they are, and in some cases, we may have parents asking for door-to-door. Remember, and we talked about this in the task force report, that if you move everybody to door-to-door, what it does is it makes your routes longer, and now you have less time available, so you can't pick up as many students. And so every one of these changes has an impact. Hazardous zones may change if you're changing eligibility. So if you were, prior to this, everybody eligible, but now you're moving to a 1 mile walk zone, within that 1 mile area, there may be some hazardous areas that you need to consider. And then we have to consider, will there be altered attendance schedules? Some of you going back with a hybrid plan. Maybe some students go 2 days, other students go the other 2 days. I know of one district where students go to school for 2 days. School's closed on Wednesdays for cleaning, and then they go back. All those are special conditions. So this is going to be the part of your routing plan that you have to wait until the very end. However, what you need to do to be successful is work on the basics, collect what you can, cleanse your data, and then this year you need to consider creating multiple plans. Put together a plan that addresses what you think is going to happen, and then put together some alternate plans. Maybe you do one plan with 2 students to a bus, or one plan with 1 student to a seat. Figure out how you want to manage that. Maybe you do a plan with, okay, we take one side of the district one day and the other side of the district the other day. So create the plan that you think is more likely, but then you're going to go ahead and have to plan some alternate plans also. So to what end? What's the ultimate goal? We need to be ready for whatever they ask for. And so let's talk about what flexibility is and what flexibility is not. Flexibility is not waiting until all the questions are answered and then getting started. Folks, if you wait until all the questions are answered, you may never get started, because we're going to start, every one of you is going to start your school year with some unanswered questions. That means you're going to have to make some assumptions. You're going to have to make some best guesses. Flexibility is having multiple plans ready, and then when they tell you what they want, you take the plan that you built that's closest to it, you make some minor adjustments, and that's what you put in place. Hopefully you're all past this, oh my gosh, what do we do? I don't have the answers yet. And you started planning. Some of your school districts have plans and you've already got your routing schedules put together. That said, don't be surprised if those plans change. We're seeing news coming out of other states. Let's look at what's going on here in Indiana. There's a number of school districts that have opened there already. One of those districts said within 2 hours, they had 12 kids in quarantine. Another school district said within the second day, they had students and teachers who were sick being infected, and they ended up closing back down again. So we may open and then close. We may start online and then go face-to-face. We may start face-to-face and then go virtual. None of us know. What we have to do is be ready for the change to happen, which means have a plan B, have a plan C, and probably this year we need to have a plan D also. So let's see what's in the chat box over here. Somebody has asked, where do you seat a child who's not wearing a mask because they have a doctor's note? I would say to you that if you've got issues with doctor's notes, um, I would not accept those without having someone at the district validate them. And again, here's a case where the district and the local health director need to decide what you're going to be your policy. If you have someone who's not allowed to wear a mask, they have a doctor's note, maybe your policy is that's a child that's not going to be allowed to ride the bus. That's harsh, but what we have to consider is, can we allow an environment to happen where a driver is put at risk and then potentially we lose a driver? Folks, none of you have enough bus drivers going into this. So I have those conversations before it happens. I think you're absolutely right to ask the question because it will happen. So that's one where you want to be ready for it. Are there other chats in there? Anybody else have other questions that they want to throw up in the chat box? So let me share with you that we'll continue to do these drop-in meetings as long as folks are attending them. If you're attending them, hopefully you're finding them useful, and we'll continue to work to bring information and updates to you. If we get to a point where you are too busy and things are too crazy to attend these things, then maybe we'll consider changing the frequency or maybe ending them and just doing written newsletters. But for the time being, we're still seeing really good attendance, and so we'll plan on our next drop-in meeting 2 weeks from today. That'll be Wednesday, August the 19th at 10 o'clock in the morning. As we've done the last couple times, I'll send out a school transportation update, and we'll put the link in there for you to sign up for the Zoom conference. There's a question about what are the requirements for preschool. Preschool requirements have not changed. If you have a preschool student that has an IEP, and in the support section of the IEP, it requires a transportation accommodation. You are required to provide transportation. So those have not been changed. Question with shared parenting, can you limit it to one stop? What was the normal last year might not be the normal this year. And if we can make a good case that for tracking purposes and for eliminating seats, can you limit students to only having one approved stops? I want you to have that conversation with your superintendent and maybe even legal counsel for the district. And maybe you get the health director involved in that one also. That is certainly the recommendation that was put out by the task force. I think it's a great recommendation, and it also helps you to budget the seats on your buses more carefully. What do we do about special needs? That's a real good question. We don't have a whole lot of guidance on special needs. ODH in their discussion, and this is why I'll get the order out for you on K through 12 wearing masks, talks about scenarios where some students may not have to wear a mask. And when I get that letter up, take a look at that, review that with your special ed director. And not every special ed child is going to be exempted from wearing a mask. Some of them certainly can wear a mask, but there may have to be some considerations there. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Again, the PowerPoint's already posted. We'll process the video on the actual conversation we had today. We'll get it posted. It takes a couple days for us to get that up. And again, I encourage you to go to the OSBA website, take a look at that pandemic resource page that OSBA has put up there. If you're interested in other schools' openings plans, take a look at them, see what's going on around you. There's nothing wrong with paying attention to what our peers are doing, learning from them. If you have questions about what they're doing, give them a call, ask them. And as always, if there's something that we can help you with, phone or email, we are working remotely. OSBA will be working remotely through the end of December this year, but we're still available. And email is always the best way to get a hold of us. So thanks for joining us this morning, and have a great day.